Ladies and gentlemen, today we look back at the extraordinary journey of a people chosen, tested, and strengthened by faith, the Jewish people. Their story, rooted in the sacred words of the Bible, is not just a historical account, but a testament to the power of belief, resilience, and divine purpose. It all begins with a man named Abraham, a man who dared to believe. When God called him to leave his homeland and go to a land that was promised but unknown, he did not hesitate. He walked forward with faith, not certainty. How many of us are afraid to step forward into the unknown? How many times do we doubt our path because we cannot see the full picture? But Abraham's journey teaches us that faith is not about seeing, it's about trusting. Through Abraham's son Isaac and his grandson Jacob, the foundation of a great nation was laid. But it was not an easy road. The Jewish people faced famine, slavery in Egypt, exile, and oppression. Yet, they never gave up. They held on to the promise that God does not abandon his people, and that trials are only steps toward a greater destiny. When Moses led them out of Egypt, parting the Red Sea, it was a reminder that even when we face what seems like an impossible barrier, God can make a way. When they wandered in the desert for 40 years, it was a lesson that patience, perseverance, and obedience shape us into who we are meant to be. The Jewish people are a living testament to the idea that no struggle is too great, no enemy too powerful, and no exile too far when faith remains unshaken. They have built, rebuilt, and thrived despite every challenge because they understood that their identity is not just in their past, but in their divine calling. The call of Abraham, a lesson in faith. The story of Abraham, known as the father of many nations, is one of the most profound examples of faith, obedience, and divine purpose found in the Bible. His journey begins not with certainty or comfort, but with a radical call from God, one that required him to leave behind everything familiar and step into the unknown with nothing but trust in the Almighty. The call of Abraham, originally named Abram, is not just a historical event, but a lesson for all of us on what it means to follow a higher calling, even when the path ahead is unclear. Abraham lived in the city of Ur, a prosperous and advanced civilization in ancient Mesopotamia. Surrounded by wealth, culture, and stability, he had every reason to stay in his homeland. Yet in Genesis 12:1-3, God commanded him to leave everything behind. Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. This was not a simple request. In ancient times, family and land were everything. To leave one's country and kindred meant leaving behind security, identity, and tradition. Yet Abraham did not hesitate. He obeyed, setting out on a journey with no destination in sight, guided only by faith. This moment teaches us that faith often requires us to step into the unknown. It is easy to trust when we can see the entire plan, when we have guarantees of success. But true faith is walking forward when nothing is certain except the one who calls us. Abraham's willingness to obey without questioning reflects an unwavering trust in God's promises. It challenges us to ask ourselves, how often do we hold back because we want all the answers first? How many opportunities do we miss because we fear the unknown? God's promise to Abraham was profound. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. These words carried the weight of destiny, not just for Abraham, but for generations to come. However, this promise came with trials, struggles, and tests of faith. The fulfillment was not immediate. Abraham faced famine, conflict, and barrenness. His wife Sarah was unable to conceive, making the promise of descendants seem impossible. Yet, despite these obstacles, Abraham believed. Romans 4:20-21 tells us, "Yet he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised." This unwavering belief is what set Abraham apart. He understood that God's promises are not always fulfilled in the way or timing we expect. Many times we grow impatient when we don't see immediate results. We doubt, we question, we try to take matters into our own hands. Abraham and Sarah, too, struggled with this. In their impatience, they tried to fulfill God's promise through human means, leading to the birth of Ishmael through Sarah's maidservant Hagar. But God's plan was different. It was not through human effort, but through divine intervention that Sarah, despite her old age, conceived Isaac, the child of the promise. This teaches us an important lesson. God's promises are fulfilled in His time, not ours. Our role is not to manipulate circumstances to fit our expectations, but to trust that He is working, even when we cannot see it. Faith is not just believing in God's promise, it is waiting on His timing. Abraham's journey was also marked by altars of worship. At every major point in his life, he built an altar to honor God. Whether in times of victory or uncertainty, he acknowledged God's presence. This reveals another crucial aspect of faith: worship in the waiting. When we are in seasons of transition, when the road ahead seems unclear, worship keeps our hearts anchored. It reminds us that our journey is not about reaching a destination, but about walking with God every step of the way. Perhaps the greatest test of Abraham's faith came when God commanded him to sacrifice his beloved son, Isaac. This was the child he had waited for, the physical manifestation of God's promise. Yet, in Genesis 22, God asked Abraham to do the unthinkable: offer Isaac as a burnt offering. Abraham obeys without hesitation, taking his son up the mountain. As he raises the knife, God intervenes, providing a ram as a substitute. This moment is one of the most powerful demonstrations of faith in all of Scripture. It shows us that true faith is total surrender. It is trusting that even when things don't make sense, God has a plan. How many of us are willing to lay down our greatest dreams, our most cherished desires, our very plans for the future, and trust that God knows what He is doing? Abraham's willingness to obey, even in the most difficult moments, set a standard for faith that continues to inspire generations. His story is not just about a man called to leave his homeland. It is about all of us called to trust, called to step out, called to believe even when circumstances seem impossible. The legacy of Abraham's faith extends beyond his lifetime. He became the father of a great nation, and through his lineage came the fulfillment of the greatest promise of all, Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world. This demonstrates that faith is never just about us. Our obedience, our trust in God has ripple effects for generations. The decisions we make today, the steps of faith we take, will impact not only our lives, but the lives of those who come after us. So what does Abraham's call teach us today? First, it reminds us that faith requires action. Abraham did not just hear God's call, he responded. Many times, we wait for the perfect conditions before we take a step forward. But faith is moving even when we don't have all the details. It is stepping into the unknown with confidence that God will guide us. Second, it teaches us that faith is tested. Abraham faced famine, waited decades for his promised son, and was asked to sacrifice what was most precious to him. Faith is not about avoiding challenges, but enduring them with trust in God's faithfulness. If you are in a season of waiting or trial, remember that every great calling comes with testing. Finally, Abraham's story teaches us that faith leaves a legacy. Because of his obedience, nations were blessed and the world was changed. Our faith is not just about our personal journey, it is about the impact we make on others. When we trust God, when we step out in faith, we inspire those around us to do the same. Today, you may feel like Abraham in the early stages of his journey, standing at the edge of the unknown, uncertain of where God is leading you. But remember this: just as God was faithful to Abraham, He will be faithful to you. If He has called you, He will sustain you. If He has promised you something, He will fulfill it. Your job is to walk forward, trusting that the one who called you is already preparing the way. Abraham's story is more than ancient history. It is a living testimony of what happens when faith meets obedience. It is a reminder that God's plans are greater than our own, that His promises never fail, and that when we trust Him completely, we step into a destiny beyond our imagination. Like Abraham, may we have the courage to say yes to the call, to walk by faith and not by sight, and to leave a legacy of belief that will inspire generations to come. Trials and strength, the road to a nation. The journey of the Jewish people from a small family to a great nation is a story of trials, perseverance, and faith. It is a story that begins with promise, but is shaped by struggle. From the moment God called Abraham and promised to make his descendants into a mighty nation, challenges arose at every step. These challenges were not just obstacles, they were tests, shaping the character of the people and preparing them for their divine destiny. The path to nationhood was not smooth, but it was purposeful. Every difficulty, every hardship, every moment of uncertainty was a step in forging a people who would endure, grow, and ultimately fulfill their purpose. The journey begins with Abraham, who obeyed God's call to leave his homeland, trusting in a promise that seemed impossible. He and his wife Sarah faced years of barrenness, waiting for the son through whom God's promise would be fulfilled. Their patience was tested, their faith stretched, and their hope challenged. Yet, through divine intervention, Isaac was born, proving that God's promises are not bound by human limitation. This moment set the precedent for the trials that would come. The understanding that faith and endurance go hand in hand. Isaac's son Jacob, later named Israel, would have 12 sons, whose descendants would become the 12 tribes of Israel. But before they could become a nation, they had to go through fire. One of Jacob's sons, Joseph, was sold into slavery by his own brothers, a betrayal that would lead to unexpected deliverance. Joseph's journey to Egypt was filled with trials, slavery, false accusations, imprisonment, yet through it all, God was with him. His faith never wavered, and in time, he rose to power as second in command to Pharaoh. When famine struck the land, it was Joseph's position in Egypt that saved his family, bringing them to safety and reuniting them in a place that, for a time, provided refuge. But the peace in Egypt did not last. As generations passed, the Israelites multiplied, and a new Pharaoh, who did not remember Joseph, came to power. Fearing their numbers, he enslaved them, forcing them into brutal labor, stripping them of their freedom, and oppressing them with cruelty. For over 400 years, they suffered under Egyptian rule, their cries rising to heaven, longing for deliverance. It was in this crucible of suffering that their identity as a people was truly formed. They were no longer just a family, they were becoming a nation, bonded not by ease, but by shared struggle and hope. In their darkest hour, God raised up a leader, Moses, a man who, like his people, had a complex and painful journey. Moses was born at a time when Pharaoh had ordered the death of all Hebrew male infants, but divine intervention spared him, and he was raised in the palace of the very king who sought to destroy his people. Though raised as an Egyptian, Moses could not ignore his true identity. In an act of impulsive justice, he killed an Egyptian taskmaster abusing a Hebrew slave and fled to the wilderness, where he remained for years, believing his purpose had ended. But God's plan was only beginning. Through a burning bush, God called Moses to return to Egypt and lead his people to freedom. It was not an easy task. Pharaoh refused to let the Israelites go, and a battle between God's power and human resistance began. 10 plagues struck Egypt, each demonstrating the futility of Pharaoh's defiance and the supremacy of the God of Israel. Finally, after the devastating plague that took the firstborn of Egypt, Pharaoh relented. The Israelites were free, but freedom was not the end of their trials. It was only the beginning. As they left Egypt, Pharaoh changed his mind, sending his army to pursue them. Trapped between the Red Sea and the advancing soldiers, fear gripped the people. It was here that one of the greatest miracles in history occurred. God parted the sea, allowing his people to cross on dry land, then closed the waters over the Egyptian army, securing their escape. This moment was more than a physical deliverance. It was a declaration that no force, no oppression, no enemy could stand against the power of God. Yet, even after witnessing such a miracle, the Israelites struggled with faith. The wilderness became a place of testing. With no food or water, they quickly turned to doubt and complaints, forgetting the power that had freed them. But each trial was met with provision. Manna fell from heaven to feed them, water flowed from a rock, and they were led by a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. These trials were not punishments but lessons, teaching them to trust, to rely on God, and to grow in strength. One of their greatest challenges came when they reached Mount Sinai. Here, God gave them the 10 Commandments, laws that would shape them into a holy nation. But even as Moses received these divine instructions, the people, impatient and faithless, built a golden calf, turning to idolatry. Their struggle was not just physical, but spiritual. Would they trust the God who had delivered them, or would they fall back into the ways of the world? This pattern of faith and failure would continue, But through it all, God remained faithful. The journey to the promised land was not immediate. Because of their lack of faith, their disobedience, and their need for transformation, what could have been a short journey stretched into 40 years of wandering. An entire generation had to pass away before the people were ready to enter the land promised to Abraham. The delay was not because God was withholding his blessing, but because the people needed to be prepared. They needed to learn reliance, discipline, and faith. Through victories and setbacks, through battles and miracles, the Israelites finally stood at the edge of their destiny. Moses, the leader who had brought them so far, would not enter with them. Instead, Joshua took up the mantle, leading them into the land that had been promised generations before. But even in the promised land, challenges remained. Conquering the land required faith and obedience. Settling required wisdom and perseverance. The road to becoming a nation was never easy. It was marked by suffering, wandering, war, and renewal. But every trial had a purpose. The suffering in Egypt forged their identity. The plagues demonstrated God's power. The wilderness taught them dependence, and the laws gave them structure. Their story is not just one of struggle, but of transformation. They were no longer just descendants of Abraham. They were the people of God, shaped by fire, strengthened by trials, and prepared for their calling. The moment when the Israelites received the law at Mount Sinai was one of the most defining events in their history. It was not just the giving of rules and commandments, it was the establishment of a covenant, a sacred agreement between God and his chosen people. This covenant set them apart from all other nations and gave them a divine purpose. The journey to Sinai had been filled with trials, but each challenge had prepared them for this moment. They had been freed from slavery, led through the wilderness, and provided for in miraculous ways. Now, they were not just a wandering group of former slaves. They were a people with an identity, a mission, and a calling. When they arrived at Mount Sinai, God called Moses up the mountain and spoke to him, giving him the commandments that would guide the Israelites in their new life. The laws were not just about religious rituals. They covered every aspect of life: justice, morality, worship, and community living. These laws were meant to shape them into a holy nation, a people who would reflect God's righteousness to the world. Unlike other nations that built their societies on human traditions and power struggles, Israel was to be governed by divine instruction, living as an example of justice, mercy, and faithfulness. The giving of the law was accompanied by an awe-inspiring display of God's power. The mountain was covered with thick clouds. Thunder roared, lightning flashed, and the earth trembled. This was not just a dramatic event. It was a declaration of the seriousness of what was happening. God was revealing himself, showing that his presence was real, powerful, and beyond human understanding. The people trembled in fear, realizing the weight of what they were about to receive. This was not just a set of guidelines, it was a direct connection to the creator of the universe, a divine standard that would define their way of life forever. One of the most important aspects of the law was the 10 Commandments. These were not just rules, but fundamental principles that would guide the people in their relationship with God and with each other. The first few commandments focused on their devotion to God: no other gods, no idols, honoring his name, and keeping the Sabbath holy. These commandments emphasized that their first priority was to remain faithful to the one who had saved them. The other commandments dealt with their relationships with others, honoring parents, refraining from murder, theft, adultery, false testimony, and coveting. These laws established a foundation for a just and moral society, ensuring that the people lived with integrity and respect for one another. But receiving the law was not just about following rules. It was about becoming a people with a divine purpose. They were chosen to be a light to the nations, to show the world what it meant to live in a way that honored God. This was a high calling, and it required discipline, obedience, and commitment. However, even as they received the law, they struggled to fully embrace it. When Moses was on the mountain for 40 days, the people grew impatient. They built a golden calf and worshipped it, quickly turning away from the God who had just delivered them. This moment showed that while laws could be given, true obedience came from the heart. The people had to learn that following God was not just about external actions, but about true devotion. Despite their failures, God remained faithful. He renewed the covenant, showing his mercy and willingness to guide them. He provided detailed instructions for the tabernacle, a dwelling place where his presence would be among them. This was a powerful reminder that God was not distant. He desired to be with his people, guiding them every step of the way. The law was not just a burden, it was a gift, a way for them to stay connected to him and to fulfill their purpose. As they continued their journey, the law became the foundation of their identity. It's one of the most important lessons we learn from the experiences of the Israelites is that adversity is not the end of the story. It is often the path to something greater. When they were enslaved in Egypt, it seemed as though there was no hope. Generations of suffering made it difficult to imagine a future of freedom. But even in their darkest moments, God was preparing them for something greater. Their pain was not meaningless. It was shaping them into a people who would one day stand strong in their faith. This teaches us that the hardships we face are not without purpose. Sometimes the struggles we endure are necessary for us to grow, to develop resilience, and to prepare us for the blessings that lie ahead. Another key lesson is the importance of faith and trust in times of uncertainty. When the Israelites stood before the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army behind them, fear gripped their hearts. They saw no way out, no path forward. But in that moment of despair, God provided a way, parting the sea and leading them to safety. This reminds us that even when we cannot see a solution, there is always a way forward. Challenges may seem impossible, but with faith, we can find the strength to move ahead. When we face difficulties, we must remember that just because we cannot see the answer does not mean there isn't one. The Israelites' journey through the wilderness also teaches us about endurance and patience. They expected an easy path to the promised land, but instead they faced hunger, thirst, and long years of wandering. Many times they became discouraged, questioning whether they would ever reach their destination. This mirrors our own struggles in life.